He saw the spit before he heard the words. It hung in the air for the briefest fraction, tiny beads catching the harsh lobby light, falling like a judgment. The droplets landed on Bernard James Kellerman's jacket, warmed by his sweat from the night's labor, and for a second the world narrowed to the cold, bright geometry of the corporate atrium, marble floor checkered with shadow, the slick sheen of polished shoes, perfumes drifting like an invisible insurance policy. The man in Spat was not a nameless stranger. He was an invited guest at the board meeting, a father figure to one of the directors, well-dressed, ringed fingers tapping impatiently on a leather briefcase. His face was red with entitlement. He spat and said it with a slow, theatrical cruelty. "You are nobody." Bernard stood with his mop in one hand and a bucket at his feet, the tentative rhythm of his breathing the only thing separating him from panic. For a lifetime he had felt the public turn itself away from the men who scrubbed its floors, the way people lowered their eyes, the way a uniform turned him into wallpaper. He had learned the small art of making himself as small as possible. Tonight, the air carried something larger than disdain. It carried a verdict. He wanted to turn, to wipe the wetness from his sleeve, to answer with a barbed quiet that would never land. Before he could shape any reply, a sound split the polished hush, a high, wet exhalation like fabric tearing, then the sickening collapse of a body. Alexandra Ashcroft, in the middle of her keynote, slid from the dais as if the world's gravity had turned traitor. Tables overturned in a flare of motion. A microphone skittered across the marble. Someone shouted for security. Someone else cursed. Bernard's first rational thought was that she had fainted. His second thought, slower, came with the smell of copper and the sight of Alexandra's face slackening into something frighteningly still. Not asleep, but gone. The room turned into an animal, breathless, panicked, hunting for a solution it did not have. Bernard dropped the mop then, metal clanging against the bucket. He moved before he thought, because motion was a logical thing to do, and because his daughter's breath, years away and now, demanded steady air. He crossed the room the way a man crosses a road to haul a child out of danger. He knelt beside Alexandra as cameras swung and phones blinked. He checked for response, leaned down to listen for breath, and felt the world coalesce into a simple protocol engraved in him by a cousin who had taught him CPR at a church basement workshop years earlier. Call for help, open the airway, chest compressions. Call 911, someone screamed. A woman in a silk suit fumbled for her phone. Typer Brigham, who had been watching with an expression of annoyance, backed away like a man removing himself from a spill. Bernard placed his hands on Alexandra's chest and found the life under the business suit, tough, pale, and very human.
He counted compressions in his head, not quite steady at first. Fear makes the rhythm clumsy. He felt the panic around him press in, the murmurs, the distant clink of a coffee cup toppling, a man's umbrella flicking as if to gesture at the absurdity of the scene. At his shoulder, the man who had spat reached with a pointed finger and struck the side of Bernard's face with the wet end of an umbrella. There was a shocked silence, then a sharper whisper, "Contaminant." Bernard braced his weight for a second and kept compressing. He breathed into her mouth once, twice, mouth to mouth as if he were praying with his hands. There was no heroism in the motion, only a machine-like repetition that refused to be sentimental. Around him, people were thinking of optics, of who would be shown on the evening loops. He heard, distantly, the whirring of the room's air handlers, the clack of a heel, an executive's voice saying the word that fell like a blade: liability. Paramedics arrived in a blur that felt both slow and too fast. They took over with quiet professional force. Attachments, checks, oxygen, the compression device that buzzed with a clinical indifference that made the moment both smaller and larger. Bernard's hands came away from Alexandra's chest as if reluctant to separate from the rhythm that had anchored him. He could see his own fingers trembling, the jolt of adrenaline making them clumsy. He smelled hospital disinfectant even before an ambulance door closed. When the stretcher carried Alexandra away, she blinked at him once, a fragile, astonished look that recognized him but could not yet frame him. Her eyes were wet and bewildered, and in that flash a human acknowledgement passed between them, unfiltered and raw. Then she was gone, and the room's attention fractured. A dozen people wanted a statement. 20 wanted a version that made it safe to sleep at night. Bernard stood in the spill of light, the stain on his jacket drying into salt and memory. He felt very much like the word the man had thrown at him. You are nobody. A camera on the far wall had caught the whole thing. Another attendee had filmed it on their phone. The footage, The slow, cheap footage that later becomes an entire narrative began its life here in the lobby, a taut little reel that would be lit and edited and splayed across feeds. Someone pressed it to the network. Someone else sent it to someone who sent it to someone else. No one in the atrium thought about what would happen to the man who had saved their CEO. If there was a single thing more dangerous than appearing in the wrong light in a room full of people with power and reputation, it was the immediate, convenient narrative. Within minutes, Tyler Brigham was composing a story. He talked in the clipped economy of people trained to spin and obfuscate. "He's a security risk," he said, or words that meant the same thing. Contamination, liability, misconduct.
The umbrella insult became the preferred detail among those who wanted to make Bernard the story's villain. Better to have him be an aggressor than to confront the image of power gasping on the marble. Security escorted Bernard to a small holding room away from the cameras. They had the tone that pretended policy, then added insult. A crisp letter with a company header and the phrase, "termination pending further review." A woman, HR, spoke in reassurances that sounded to him like they were written by someone who had never run out of money. She asked for his identification, his recollection. She told him to wait. His mop waited in the lobby, abandoned, an echo of the dignity that had been stripped so quickly it had no time to protest. Outside that waiting room, the world alchemized the moment. A 30-second clip showed the spit and the shove and then the life-saving compressions. Still images were pulled and given captions that leaned toward accusation. An upturned shot of Bernard's hands, the CEO's limp figure, the janitor's body looming, which to some eyes made for a neat, scandalous composition. Anonymous posts called him aggressive. An image, cropped and darkened, was slapped with a rumor. People who had not been there read the rumors. Voices grew louder because conflict feeds attention. It is always easier to believe in a villain than to hold two uncomfortable truths at once. By the time Bernard managed to leave the building, released because no charges were pressed, because it was easier to move a human being out of frame than to investigate a systemic failure, someone had already posted a version of the story with his name attached. That was the first cut. He returned home beneath a sky the color of ash, carrying a sense of bewilderment that would not quite resolve into anger. He had done what anyone would do. He had acted. Yet his receipt from the company for the night's labor bore the thin, unforgiving arithmetic of a life that never found room for flattery. 2 hours of overtime, a note that further investigation might follow, and the memory of an umbrella on his cheek. His apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building that had once promised better things. The radiator rattled in the corner like an old man clearing his throat. A carpet patch was threadbare where Molly had learned to patter across the floor as a toddler. A poster of a baseball player, fading, peered from the wall because some things are larger than shame. Janet Holloway, who lived next door and had seen Bernard since he moved in 3 years earlier, had a stove that gave heat when it felt like it, and a garden of potted herbs that were the only green things in both their lives. Molly was sitting at the kitchen table when Bernard opened a door. She was 9, with her mother's stubborn chin and her father's careful, wary eyes. She looked up in a way that tried to say everything, and then shrank back. "Daddy?"
she asked, voice small, as if the world might have been kinder if it had lowered its voice to her pitch. Bernard held her without words for a moment. Her hair smelled like apples and the dry detergent her teacher liked. He had planned to tuck her into bed and tell her a story about stars and trucks. Instead, he held her and tried, uselessly, to calibrate the weight of being both the person who had saved a woman in a boardroom and the person the public had begun to suspect. The eviction notice slipped under the apartment door 3 days later like a punctuation mark. Late rent, it said. They could remedy it with a payment plan, but the plan required resources that, between paychecks, a broken bicycle, the cost of prescriptions, did not exist. Bernard called the company number listed on his final pay stub. HR reiterated the company's commitment to review and offered, in language that bent and distanced coldly, a talking point about protecting all employees. Protecting all employees, meanwhile, meant pushing a single janitor into the background to preserve a narrative of corporate competence. The smear spread in pockets he could not see. A colleague from another building called with apologies quickly given and then retracted when he answered the phone. A neighbor crossed the street to avoid speaking to him because someone had said something about him, an accusation that suggested physical impropriety during the incident. The economy of rumor is strange. A single hint of impropriety is a currency that travels fast. Bernard started sleeping with the television on because silence had become too loud. He went days on the cheap meals he could cobble together: instant noodles, canned beans, the bread that would stay longer than produce. He cut down on the salt that once made a night's stew taste like triumph. He walked Molly to school and sat on a park bench while she bounced into the building like an energy he could not manufacture for himself. At night, he counted the ways the world had rearranged itself around him. Janet came by with a casserole once a week and an old wool blanket when it grew colder. She pressed the blanket into his hands without comment. "You can't always be the scaffolding for other people, Bernard," she said once, as if lecturing both him and the universe, "but you can keep your back straight." He would have laughed if laughter felt possible. Instead, he kept his back straight and let the room of small kindnesses hold him up like temporary scaffolding. Tyler Brigham's memos were efficient and surgical. "Protect the brand," he wrote to a short list of recipients. He buried names in clauses about pending inquiries. He recommended lawyers, a PR quick fix that did not call itself a cover-up. Somewhere in his office, he looked at the footage again and manipulated it in his head as if it were clay. In his mind, Bernard was a problem to be sterilized.
If the janitor's last name leaked, if it moved from anonymous accusation into a space where the man might be seen and heard, Tyler knew there would be consequences, not only reputational, but logistical. Rumors are fragile, names are anchors. A name makes it harder to pretend a person is only an outline. The social swarm fed on a convenient small lie that a janitor had assaulted the CEO and then, in a twist, disguised himself as a savior. A still frame, Bernard's hands on Alexandra's chest, became a weapon used by those who did not want to face the possibility that human beings on opposite sides of a room could be more alike than different. The smear did not need facts, it only needed velocity. Bernard received the formal termination on a piece of letterhead the following week. It was sterile and precise. Employment terminated effective immediately, pending investigation into conduct during the incident on indefinito. They offered him a minimal severance, a non-disclosure form with language like a noose, and a voucher for 3 months' access to an employee assistance program. He read the clause that said he was not to speak about the incident publicly, and felt something, some small, bright indignation, flutter in his chest before it was trained into the weary, practical notion of survival. The first nights after the termination were worse. He ate less. He stopped taking pride in small things. The mop in the closet became a relic of a life he had been scrubbed off. Molly watched him worry, and, with the blunt efficiency of children, asked questions that had the brutal logic of truth. "Are we going to be okay?" she would ask in the morning, pushing damp curls behind her ear. Bernard's sealed juvenile record, years old, an embarrassment he had kept private because it served as a punctuation to a boy's single mistake, was dragged up by someone with nothing to lose and then framed as a pattern. He did not defend the old scar because he had learned the cruel lesson that a defensive posture looks like guilt to some. He wished people would sit with discomfort instead of building their certainties on the scaffolding of rumor. He wanted to tell them what he had always told Molly, that people make mistakes and that forgiveness is a muscle you use until it strengthens. But forgiveness requires others. People's forgiveness was in short supply. He began to feel the world closing in, not dramatically but surely, the way winter presses on a plant. His stomach tightened, and he began to dream of hospital monitors humming like insects. He had always been healthy, but the constant tension frayed the stitches of that health. He found himself dizzy in the shower, hands fumbling for the towel. He leaned against the sink and tried to breathe, counting like he had been taught. 1, 2, 3, to steady himself against the world that had suddenly become an engine of rumor. Up the hill, over glass and concrete, Alexandra Ashcroft woke in a sterile hospital room to the echo of monitors and the flat color of fluorescent light. The boutique of her life, the precise wardrobe, the press releases, the quarterly forecasts, had always been a room she could step into and control. For a moment she was disoriented, flustered by her vulnerability, by the sensation that life had been yanked from her and then returned with trembling hands. Nurses flitted in and out with paperwork, asking which cardiologist she'd prefer and offering bland, sympathetic phrases. Someone mentioned that she'd received emergency CPR. A security officer, discreet and efficient, told her there was video, an attendee's phone had captured the incident. Her curiosity was quiet at first, then hot. She wanted to see. She wanted the picture that would be shown on screens that night to be one she recognized, to be one that still allowed her to be the axis of the story. The nurse brought a tablet. Fiona Redford, Alexandra's liaison, materialized at the door like a shadow that wore a blazer.
Fiona's face told an unspoken pull, potential scandal, potential crisis, potential for an apology that would read as charity. When Alexandra pressed play on the footage, the world rearranged. She watched the man in the uniform move in the way a surgeon moves inside a human body, steady and nothing theatrical. She watched her own body go slack, and someone's hands press, push, insist on air and rhythm. She watched with an odd feeling of both distance and intimacy the act that had pulled her back from thinness. There was a moment in the clip when the camera captured the entitled man's spit, and the line that followed, and the umbrella's quick, ugly strike. Alexandra felt something in her chest that was not merely physical, a bubbling shame, as if the frame had captured not only tactile gestures but moral dispositions. She had been rushed, aware that her pulse had stalled beneath her ribs. She had not, in those seconds, processed the look of contempt aimed at the man who held her life in his hands. Fiona did not look away. "This could be messy," she said businesslike. "We can manage the narrative. We have legal." Alexandra turned the device off before Fiona could finish. The screen went black like a blink, but the image had already lodged itself under her ribs. The thought of the janitor being accused while she had been somewhere between life and death felt like a private betrayal, of the kind that corroded quietly. She heard Tyler's voice in meetings, did the math in her head of what a bad headline would cost her stockholders, but she felt something else too, a personal private responsibility that did not care for long-term projections. Later that evening, while the city lights made designs on the hospital curtains, Alexandra asked for the secure footage to be copied and handed to her personally. She wanted it on a drive.
She called in Marcus, one of her aides, and asked for the name of the man whose hands were visible in the clip. Marcus hesitated, as if standard operating procedure had a hand up its sleeve that he had to unfold carefully. He checked a list, scrolled through an employee roster that treated names like items in inventory. "Bernard James Kellerman," he said finally. He did not look at Alexandra, as if naming him was an intrusion. The name landed in Alexandra's mouth like a live coal. It was a small sound, a syllable that made the word more than a faceless thing. She realized she had thought of him as the janitor, anonymous, until a name gave gravity where none had been required before. The knowledge changed the geometry of moral obligation. It drew a line. She told Fiona quietly, with a voice that carried a new, less corporate steel, "Find him." Fiona nodded, a professional nod that deflected intimacy. "We'll locate him through auxiliary staff records and security footage," she said. "We'll offer support if appropriate. We'll handle the public messaging." There was a coda to that request. In Tyler's office, someone mentioned in passing the danger of names. "We can't make him a martyr," Tyler had said earlier in a private call, fingers steepled. "We make him anonymous, and we control the narrative. If his last name goes public and people rally around him, it becomes a different story." The words were not cruel in that room. They were tactical. For Tyler, names were chess pieces. For Alexandra, the name had become a human face. Back in his apartment, Bernard sat at the window and watched a traffic light change. He had been so busy keeping breathing in rhythm, first for others, then for himself, that he had not stopped to think about what a name could do to people. His own name had a history that lay folded and closed, like a book he touched only when necessary. He had not wanted visibility. He wanted to work and to pay his rent, and to make Molly laugh at night. When his phone rang that night and an automated voice told him he had been assigned a case number and that HR requested he not comment publicly, Bernard stared at the ceiling and felt the slow, sharp squeeze of isolation. He could imagine the headlines, the social appetite for spectacle. He could imagine 1,000 hands pointing. He thought of Molly sleeping in the next room, of her small chest rising and falling, and the way a child trusts the world to be steady. He promised himself small things, to find a second job if he had to stay upright for his daughter. He did not promise that he would be silent, because silence had in the boardroom already been turned into a weapon. Outside, the city hummed with obliviousness. Inside, in a hospital room over glass and concrete, a woman who had been given a second chance held a drive that contained a man's name and its living proof. She felt a responsibility and no legal memo could fully outline.
Across town, in a small apartment, a father who had saved a life waited in a darkness made of rumor and thin hope. A few hours after he had been told he was under review, Bernard's vision blurred at the edges. He rose to find water, the world pitching like a small boat. The apartment walls seemed to tilt. He sat at the edge of the bed and tried to breathe with the slow, formal counting that had always steadied him. He felt the old scar tissue of embarrassment and hardship press against him. He pressed his hand to his chest and felt the irregularity there, a little flutter like a trapped bird. He stood, walked to the sink, and warmed water to splash onto his face. The overhead light hummed. He bent and leaned against the counter, trying to marshal himself into ordinary motions. Open the medicine cabinet, take down the little bottle he kept for headaches, swallow the pill like a promise. He fell to his knees as if his legs had been cut. The thought that rose was crude and terrible and immediate. What would happen to Molly if he could not stand? The world became the sharp smell of detergent and a memory of cold hospital air. He imagined paramedics in the building corridor, the light blink of an ambulance. He imagined Alexandra's hands, the ones that had compressed until breath returned, and he thought of the way those hands had been surrounded by disdain. He felt the room tilt away. The radiator's rattle turned into an ocean. He tried to call for Janet, but his phone slid from his fingers and clattered on the linoleum. The ceiling came closer like a closing lid. For a moment his breath was small and useless, and the apartment seemed full of things he'd never managed to fix. Then, in that thin throat of a moment, footsteps sounded in the hall, steady, measured. The door was louder than usual because everything was louder now. Someone knocked, a soft, insistent knock. Bernard tried to pull himself up and for a second considered not answering, as if the simplest act of human contact had become a greed he could not afford. He forced himself to stand. When he opened a door, he saw a woman, medical uniform, clipboard tucked under her arm, eyes soft with a practiced worry. Behind her, a neighbor peered. Janet, cheeks flushed, knitting needle dangling in her hand like a flag. "You okay, Bernard?" Janet asked, voice carrying the blunt, necessary kindness of people who have seen a person through many winters. He wanted to say, "I was arrested," or "I saved a life," or "They made me nothing." Instead, he said, "I'm fine," in the way the world knows is untrue. He let them in. Janet's presence had the effect of a hand on the steering wheel. They sat with him and listened as he described the boardroom, the spit, the umbrella, the compressions. They listened to the way a story can weigh a person down and watched the way one man can be turned into an image. Above, light spilled from the stairwell like a cold promise.
He felt foolish and brave in the same motion. At the hospital, Alexandra sat up and reviewed the footage again, then put the drive into a secured envelope stamped with the company's seal. She made a decision that would not be popular in her meetings. She signed an internal memo to freeze any internal narratives until she had a fuller picture. She also, in a private moment, scribbled a note, something no boardroom memo would contain, about gratitude and obligation. She slid the envelope into her bag and tapped her phone to call an executive assistant. Her voice was steady, but strange, as if it were the sound of someone stepping into colder water. "Find Bernard Kellerman," she said, and the name that had been an anchor for Tyler's tactics now moved like a compass in her chest. When Bernard fell asleep that night, it was with the couch's arm pressing into his ribs and Molly's small hand folded into his. He thought, in the clarity of fatigue, about the absurdity that had accompanied heroism in his life, the idea that saving someone's life could turn you instantly into a suspect. He dreamed, briefly, of a stage like the boardroom, where a man's work is measured in a ledger, and where letters are cold and public. Outside, lights blinked and news feeds spun. The story that had begun with a spit and a shove was becoming more complicated by the hour, and two people who had been connected by a single, decisive moment were starting to feel the pull in different directions, one into public control, one into private ruin. When the morning light came, it slid across a world that had already begun to pick sides. In a high-rise office, a woman who had been given back her breath reviewed a clip of a man using his hands for life. In a worn apartment, a father woke to a thin, pressing hunger in the knowledge that his life had been drawn into an orbit it had never sought. Neither of them knew yet what would happen next. They only knew that their lives had braided together in a way that would not be easily undone. Somewhere between contempt and compassion, a choice had been set like a hinge. One person stood ready to make a move that could break the hinge or mend it. The other stood on the ragged edge of a long slide downward. In somewhere, in a room where a CFO sorted words like surgical instruments, a strategist was calculating the danger of a name becoming public, because a last name could change everything, could turn a smear into a spotlight, could threaten the fragile architecture of a narrative
built to protect a balance sheet. Tyler imagined headlines that carried a name across dinner tables. He imagined the power of a last name, like a key, unlocking complicity, and bringing with it consequences he did not wish to meet. Outside the hospital, a van idled. Inside the apartment, a blanket warmed two sleeping bodies.
The world held its breath in the narrow spaces between rumor and truth, while a small, stubborn hope threaded its way through the rooms, that someone would look, really look at what had happened, and respond not with spin, but with repair. Subscribe to follow the whole story. Bernard woke under the fluorescent insistence of a hospital corridor, the smell of antiseptic like a distant sea. His mouth tasted of iron and regret. For a few slow beats he couldn't place himself. Then a nurse's socked foot brushed the cot, a clipboard whispered, and the memory folded back in. The boardroom lights, the umbrella, the compressions, the way faces had turned away. He had been taken in the night after his near fainting. The neighbor had insisted. A dispatcher had been called. And then 2 paramedics had made the choice he had not let himself admit he needed. They had watched the EKG line climb sluggishly on a small screen and said things that were both alarmed and professional. They had given him IV fluids, glucose checks, the small stabilizing rituals of modern ministrations. He had been kept overnight for observation. He had slept like a man who had been given a brief, grudging reprieve. When the curtain eased back and light met him, there was a woman in a blazer he recognized from the footage. Only up close she was less the glossy image of a CEO, and more a person whose sharpness had been tempered by something like fear. Alexandra Ashcroft sat in a chair that had been dragged into a corner, fingers pressed around a paper cup she could not seem to finish. Her face was not the pastel, practiced apology of an executive portrait. It was raw in a way that made Bernard think of stripped paint and the honest wood beneath. She stood when he opened his eyes fully, and for an absurd, suspended second, they looked at each other like people who had been given the same odd private catalog of memory. Breath, compressions, the blunt business of saving a life. "Mr. Kellerman," she said before she could stop herself, and the name landed like a bell. "Bernard, Her voice shortened. The sentence wanted charity and instead found accountability. "I need to thank you, but that's not enough. Can you tell me what happened, from your side?" Bernard blinked, searching for the edge between gratitude and humiliation. Words had been used against him before. He had learned how to make sentences as modest as his life allowed. "I did what I know," he said finally. "I did what I learned at church with my cousin. I did what I would want someone to do for Molly." She listened with the attention of someone cataloging a new map. When he mentioned Molly, her expression softened in a way that seemed to cost something. Perhaps not money, but something like pride. "Where does she live?" she asked. "Is she here?" "No," he said. "3rd floor. Janet helps." The names came like a small geography of people who had kept him upright. He felt foolish for needing to explain, as if his life were a file she could approve. Alexandra exhaled. "We'll make sure she's taken care of," she said. And the sentence had concrete edges, no vague promises, no rhetorical flourishes. She sat back down and took from her bag a small official envelope with the company crest stamped on the flap. Inside was a page on corporate letterhead, a short, plainly worded acknowledgement that Bernard's actions were those of someone responding to an emergency, and an invitation to come to the company for the next steps. There was a line indicating immediate exploratory support, a stipend, short-term housing assistance, and an offer to liaise with PR to correct misinformation. He studied it, like a man looking at a document from a world he had not had standing in. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, blunt as a hammer. "Because you're the truth of what happened," Alexandra said simply. "Because I don't want my company to treat you like an inconvenience, and because I can't unsee what I saw." There was a pause. "I want to help fix what we started." Bernard felt an emotion he had not named in years, suspicion that could shade into hope. "I don't want charity," he said. "I just want fairness." She nodded. "Then take the fairness. Let us correct the record." Her tone carried a firmness that felt like a tool. Outside the hospital,
in a glass box lined with polished mahogany and expense accounts. Tyler Brigham watched not the footage repeatedly. He had already crafted versions in his head, but the contours of damage to the bottom line. He had teams that could file statements, hire consultants, and promote a different narrative. When Alexandra's aide told him the CEO had asked that Bernard be located and that the company would be offering support, Tyler's jaw tightened. Names changed the geometry of PR. A name with a face made it harder to smother a story. The fewer people who can rally around him, the better, Tyler told his counsel, in a tone that was all business. Once a name hits public appetite, people start building stories. We need the incident framed as a security breach, not as a moral reckoning. Someone in the room, quiet and younger, asked, "What if she makes a statement?" Tyler's laugh was dry. "Then we neutralize. We do the paperwork, prove compliance with policy, and make sure our legal posture is watertight." His reference to water felt like an intentional metaphor, drowned the inconvenient man in compliance in process. But Alexandra had already started moving in a different orbit. By noon, she had dispatched Marcus and Fiona to get Bernard stable, find immediate housing if needed, and draft an internal memo clearing him of wrongdoing pending a thorough, transparent review. She insisted on contacting the security vendor herself and asked to see the unedited footage from the entry cameras. She wanted witness statements.
Her decisions were not gestures, but small blueprints of repair. Authenticate the facts first, correct misinformation second, and create a channel of real support for the person who had saved her. When Alexandra arrived at Bernard's building 2 hours later, she had not expected to see Janet sitting on the steps, knitting in a way that kept her hands from trembling. Janet's face was both skeptical and relieved at the same time. She had watched the slow-motion collapse of a neighbor's life, and had been one of the first to act when Bernard had been ill. Waiting there too, clutching a backpack with a few toys, was Molly, hair still a little mussed from sleep, eyes like a careful horizon. Bernard stepped out of the doorway, jacket buttoned clumsily, as if an invisible seam had been stitched into him by public attention. He had kept his back straight because he had been taught to, and because the best parts of him felt obligated to not give his daughter more to worry about. Alexandra stepped forward the way someone with means learns to step, decisive, almost apologetic for the bluntness of privilege. "Bernard," she said, "I'm Alexandra Ashcroft. I came to—" She stopped as if the sentence carried too much credit. "I came because I owe you thanks, and because I don't want the company to treat you as if you're disposable." Bernard's eyes narrowed in a way that was not hostile, but assessing. He had been measured and mistreated in equal measure over the past week. "You don't know what it's like to be made nothing," he said. She did not flinch. "I'm learning," she answered, "and I want to make this right, starting with you and your daughter." There were no cameras on the stoop, no microphones to catch the sincerity or the doubt. There was only wind and the urban thump of a city that keeps moving. Janet pressed forward with the practicalities of small-town caregiving, an extra blanket folded away in her arms, an offer to babysit if Bernard needed time, a list of local services. It was the kind of generosity that could not be stamped in a press release. Within the day, Alexandra's team had found a small apartment for them in a building closer to the center, furnished modestly but with a stove that worked and a heater that hummed without sounding like a complaint. The company paid for the first month and put someone on the case to expedite benefits. They arranged for food cards and a local pediatrician to see Molly without delay. This was concrete help. It was not the sweeping repentance of a billboard apology, but it mattered where it counted. Word of the company's assistance moved through internal channels before it became public. Tyler's team bristled. "We need to control the narrative," he said again, but his voice had the strained quality of someone who feared the anchor of a name. He asked his people to search for vulnerabilities, old records, financial mistakes, anything that could be used to undermine Bernard before the public could rally to him.
It felt tactical, like a preemptive strike. In a small room across from the legal team, Fiona and Marcus compiled statements, payroll records, and security footage. They worked to create an airtight chronology of what had happened. Marcus found, in an employee file, the sealed, juvenile record that Bernard had long ago thought buried. It had no bearing on the moment in the boardroom, but Tyler's aides, hungry for dissonant details, forwarded that file to a private investigator, with a note in the margins, "Let's see if there's fuel here." It was the moment when the smear campaign almost found momentum, a slender, unethical thread being readied into a rope. When Alexandra learned of the intention to mine Bernard's past for leverage, she went incandescent. "We will not weaponize a man's childhood mistakes to save our optics," she told Tyler in a meeting that felt like a held breath. He did not argue that she was wrong. He argued that she was naive. "Names are dangerous," he said, softer now, the schemer dislodged from his usual clarity. If the last name goes public and there's a narrative of systemic exploitation, we are vulnerable. She met his sentence with a look that had no need to be civil. We are vulnerable because we allowed someone who saved my life to be smeared, she said. So our response is to restore him, not to bury him. Tyler understood the implication. A public restoration would force a larger reckoning. Questions about worker treatment, breaks, on-site health care, staff representation and safety procedures. It would be messy and expensive. It would expose the company's blind spots. It would force changes in policy and perhaps unmask people who had benefited from the status quo. For a moment, the power in the room was not in the spreadsheet, but in conscience. While corporate meetings moved like a chessboard at the top of a glass tower, the smear machine had already reached the street level. Anonymous posts surfaced with suggestive captions. A local gossip blog published a tentative story that hinted at an incident with a janitor. An anonymous commenter suggested impropriety. A social thread picked up an old photograph of Bernard taken years earlier during a community event and claimed it as evidence of a pattern. The velocity was what frightened Bernard. It did not matter that most posts had no corroboration. What mattered was that they stacked like logs against a fragile hearth of reputation. He found himself fearful again, not of the blow to his chest, but of the blow to his name. He had never wanted to be a public figure. Publicity felt like a light that could scorch. When the first shaky headline ran with his name included, one of Tyler's aides had leaked it to a contact who relished scandal. Bernard sat on the couch and watched it scroll across a borrowed tablet, with gravity pressing the breath from him.
Molly climbed into his lap and, as children do, made of their routine a small sanctuary. "Will they stop you from working?" she asked. "They're trying," he said. "But I saved someone, Molly. I did what any person should do. That's the end of it." Her small hand curled into his shirt like a secret. "They can't make you mean," she said, with the precise logic of a child who had only known him as hero and father. Her words were medicine and foolishness at once. Alexandra was not content with private aid. She wanted to cut the smear off at its head. She posted a carefully worded public statement. No theatrics, only facts. Alexandra thanked emergency responders, identified Bernard as the person who had performed CPR, and offered to cooperate with law enforcement and to review internal protocols for emergency response. She also attached, in a secure and notarized addendum, a statement acknowledging the footage and confirming the sequence of events. The notarized line carried weight. It was a legal and ethical anchor, a public clearing that made it harder for Tyler's team to dredge up an old scar and present it as a pattern. Tyler, flustered, tried to spin again. He released a statement couched in corporate care. "We are committed to due process," that slid a sentence in the direction of vagueness. But Alexandra's notarized statement and the unedited footage they released undercut his cautious narrative. People could now see the full sequence, the spit, the shove, the compressions. The public, hungry as it is for both outrage and justice, began to tilt toward outrage, for Bernard and for the company's initial reflex to scuttle him. Tyler's panic was small and private, but he understood the danger of a name on a trending feed. A last name becomes a rallying cry when it connects to unfairness. He had always used namelessness as a tool. A nameless problem is easy to dismiss. A named person becomes a story with a human center. As pressure mounted, more difficult truths surfaced behind closed doors. The internal review uncovered a failure in company policy, a lack of training for non-medical emergencies among staff, no clear protocol to protect officials from being the only point of responsibility in a life or death moment, and management memos that favored optics over rigorous safety training. These were not scandalous in the court of public opinion sense, but they had consequences. People's safety depended on them. In the days that followed, Alexandra did something that had ripples far beyond a single apology.
She convened a staff meeting and announced a multi-pronged initiative: immediate compensation and housing for Bernard and other affected staff, an independent audit of emergency response protocols across all company sites, mandatory CPR and first aid training for front of house and managers, the establishment of a worker welfare department tasked with improving basic conditions, transportation stipends, dependable break rooms, access to healthcare navigation, and subsidized childcare for employees with young children. It was not an empty gesture. She authorized funds, set timelines, and named people to lead the effort, explicit, measurable steps. When she publicly offered Bernard a role leading the new initiative, Director of Employee Welfare, an unusual position for someone with his background, the offer read like a radical pivot, from hero to employee representative to institutional change agent. Alexandra's argument was simple. Who better to lead a program that would protect workers than someone who had lived the consequences of their invisibility? Bernard's first reaction was the one he had practiced, caution. "I don't want to be used as a prop," he told her. He had seen what tokenism could look like, a smiling face in a public photo, while systemic rot remained. He asked for details: budget, authority, reporting structure, the capacity to make real decisions, not a title with no teeth. Alexandra provided them. She signed documents establishing an independent oversight board with community representation, ensured direct reporting to herself, and removed any clause that would allow the role to be scapegoated or curtailed by PR. He agreed, slowly, on one condition. Janet would have a job helping to run community outreach, and Molly would be given a stable school placement without the threat of being moved. Alexandra agreed publicly, and the moments of ink and signatures began to feel less like charity and more like partnership. Tyler did not fold without a fight. He circulated memos questioning the wisdom of appointing an unvetted outsider to a sensitive role. He whispered to board members that making a person the face of reform was risky. What if Bernard made demands the company could not meet? What if activists used him to force costly changes? His caution was not abstract. It was the calculus of someone tied to quarterly numbers. When leaked documents showed attempts to dig up Bernard's juvenile record or to plant anonymous posts, Alexandra moved decisively. She fired the HR head who had colluded with a private investigator that crossed ethical lines. Tyler's direct subordinates found themselves reassigned. The company instituted a new transparency policy. Any internal investigations would be reviewed by an independent oversight committee that included community representatives. The board was not thrilled. Some members argued that such moves were expensive and unnecessary, but the public reaction to Bernard's case had shifted the balance.
For Alexandra, the decision felt not only morally right, but a business necessity to restore trust. Bernard's work was different from the job he had done, but it felt close to what he had always been, a practical, problem-solving life. He arrived at his first day with a simple notebook, a pen, and a nervousness he hid with a grin. On the wall of the new welfare office, there was a framed photograph someone had taken of the boardroom rescue, the uncropped, honest image showing hands and people, not a manufactured tableau. Bernard did not like being in photos, but he kept that one because it had truth in it. His first weeks on the job were spent listening. He hosted small tables in the break rooms. He walked the corridors after midnight shifts and learned the names of people cleaning offices in the early hours. He pushed for transportation stipends that meant parents could reliably get to work without fearing a broken bus. He worked with local childcare providers to set up subsidized spaces near company properties. He insisted that break rooms look like actual places to rest, with chairs that supported backs and coffee that did not taste like corporate denial. He argued for paid time for training and for clearer mechanisms that allowed workers to report concerns without fear of retaliation. None of it was poetic. He wrote grant-style memos, he read financial projections, he argued at meetings with people who had whiteboards and different languages for numbers. He learned to translate lived experience into policy proposals. Sometimes he failed. A pilot transportation program faltered because a contractor misread routes. A proposed childcare vendor failed a safety audit and had to be replaced. Each failure was the sort of thing that could have pushed him back into the protective shell of despair. Instead, he called Janet, and she reminded him that rebuilding takes 100 small corrections, not a single dramatic act. Publicly, the story shifted. Alexander's notarized statement and the new initiatives were reported in cautious tones at first, but voices of support, local clergy, community leaders, parent groups, joined in. The smear that had nearly consumed him lost its oxygen. Tyler, pressured by the board and by a sense that his tactics had become a liability, resigned under the pretense of strategic realignment. He was not villainized in melodrama. He left with his dignity intact, but his influence diminished. It was both a pragmatic removal and a symbolic gesture, a sign that the company would stop using optics to suffocate truth. Bernard's public visibility grew in ways that felt strange to him. A local coalition invited him to speak at a labor rights gathering. An employee-organized forum asked him to explain the new policies. He found that when he spoke, people listened not because of a title, but because he spoke plainly of things they recognized: missed meals, missed bus schedules, the indignity of being called a liability.
His voice was steady. He did not need drama to make his point. The national conference came like a long-sought, trembling shore. Alexandra, in a brief opening, credited the employees who had prompted change and named Bernard as the initiative's director. He stood at a podium with a microphone that made his voice sound too large in the beginning. He had to adjust to the sensation of being heard by hundreds. Molly sat in the front row, legs crossed, hands clenched in a way that made her look older and smaller at the same time. Janet stood at the back, her knitting bag at her feet like an anchor. Bernard's speech was not a manifesto. It was a set of stories, a bus that did not come, a night shift worker who hadn't had a break to warm her hands, a co-worker who skipped insulin because time off would mean losing pay. He spoke of gaps, not only in policy, but in basic human regard, and he framed solutions as practical fixes with moral weight. He mentioned the first things he had implemented: reliable transportation assistance, on-site childcare pilots, mandatory CPR training for all staff, and a new rest space policy. He told the room that dignity is not expensive, it is intentional. When he finished, the applause was good and not performative. People stood, some with tears, some with notebooks. Molly ran to the stage after the conference and threw her arms around him, a small meteor with all her love concentrated in one movement. For Bernard, the moment was less about vindication and more about a truth that had come full circle, that being seen could change things, not for one person, but for many. The final piece of the arc was less public than the conference, but no less significant. The company issued a formal letter, backed by signed statements from Alexandra and the Oversight Committee, acknowledging the initial mishandling of the incident and committing to the reforms Bernard's role demanded. They posted a public, notarized statement clearing Bernard of wrongdoing during the CEO's emergency and detailing the concrete steps the company would take to prevent such mistreatment again. The notarization was legal validation. The letter was moral. Tyler's attempts to leverage a name as a weapon fell flat against documented facts and a transparent process. In private, there were awkward conversations and apologies that felt incomplete. Some people who had been quick to judge reached out with notes that began with "I'm sorry," but didn't quite know how to unlearn years of behavior. Bernard accepted these imperfect apologies in the way someone accepts a bandage, necessary and not a cure. Months later, on a quiet evening when the company's press pages had cooled and the new programs had their first operational metrics, Bernard and Molly stood on the small balcony of their apartment. The city spread out below them, streetlights like patient stars, buses ferrying people towards homes, the distant thrum of an evening that did not pause for anyone.
They had learned how to live with less worry about whether rent would be paid next month. Janet had a steady job assisting with outreach, and Molly had friends at her new school who had not been raised by rumor. "You did a good thing, Daddy," Molly said, leaning into him. Her voice had the directness of children who understand the world in terms of deeds. "You helped somebody." He kissed the top of her head and let the smell of her hair, apple and detergent again, anchor him. "You helped me," he corrected softly. "You kept me up. You kept me honest." She looked out at the city with a small gravity. "Are people nicer now?" she asked, the question holding both the wish and the worry of a child. Bernard considered the long list of small changes they had made: longer breaks, a stipend for gas money, a childcare room that looked like a real room rather than an afterthought. He considered the fired HR head, the reassigned CFO, the Oversight Committee, the notarized letters, and the faces of people at the conference who had cried and clapped. He thought of Tyler's tactics, and how fragile a name can be when used as a tool to erase a person's humanity. "They're trying to be," he said finally. "Some people are, and some people still have to learn." Molly made a face. "Well, if they don't learn, you'll hit them with a speech," she declared. Bernard laughed, imagining the idea with a tenderness that made his chest feel light. Below, in the lit windows of a building across the street, an old man in a suit, someone who might once have spat when he thought himself entitled, watched the world. The titles and the scandals and the quick judgments had not disappeared. They had only been nudged by a single unglamorous human moment back toward a better shape. The man's expression showed something like shame, or perhaps an old man learning late that the world demands better. For Tyler, the fear of a last name had been not so much terror as an awakening. Names are not leverage when they belong to human beings with stories and advocates and a capacity to mobilize moral pressure. A last name can rally a community. For Bernard, a last name had been the tether that almost pulled him under. For Tyler, the prospect of it had been the thing that threatened a comfortable system. They had moved, all of them, in different directions. Some had been dragged forward by consequence, some had walked there. Institutional reform had not been universal or immediate, and Bernard knew that a policy could be rescinded or ignored in another context. What mattered in the choosing of the long day was that he and Molly had been given stability. What mattered was that he had been heard and given the authority to build systems that might prevent another person from becoming, for a moment, the world's nobody. That night, Bernard tucked Molly into bed and told her a story about a man who learned what it meant to be seen.
It was a story he had started telling himself in the hospital, a small ritual that stitched nights into something resembling peace. Janet stopped by with muffins the next morning, and the rhythm of their days resumed. Work, school, small acts of neighborly grace. On the balcony, they watched the city slow. The news cycle would move on. Another headline would seek attention. But the small office Bernard now ran would continue to answer calls from workers who needed help getting to shifts, from parents needing safe childcare, from custodians whose health issues deserved respect. The reforms would be imperfect. They would be fought over in meetings and budgets, but they existed. Alexandra's role had shifted too. She had gone back into the boardroom with a new perspective, the kind that made a woman who had been saved see a ledger as people again, rather than only as numbers. She put her weight behind the program, and when queried by shareholders, defended it as good governance and ethical necessity. She had admitted publicly that saving a life put obligations on those with power, not merely gratitude. Months later, at a small ceremony in the company's atrium, Bernard stood to cut a ribbon for the first employee wellness center. The room smelled of fresh paint and coffees, the trappings of institutional optimism. People who had once looked through him now met his eyes. When he spoke, he did not ask for mercy or praise. He asked only for work to be measured in the dignity it allowed. After the speeches, as people drifted through the new space, sitting in chairs that supported backs, praising the new childcare corner, Bernard took Molly to the balcony once more. She leaned against him and watched the same traffic below. "You were scared when they put your name out there, weren't you?" she asked, not confronting but curious, like a child reading a book where the hero had been surprised. He thought of the hollow hours when rumor had sounded like a drum. He remembered the umbrella flick, the smear that grew wings, the nights when silence was a blade. "Yes," he said simply. "It was scary. Names can be used to tear people down." She considered that. "But now your name helps other people," she observed. He smiled with a tired, genuine relief. "That's the best thing a name can do." Below, lights blinked in the city, and the rhythm of everyday life, buses, laundromats, people walking dogs, carried on. They had not solved everything. They had not erased every unfairness. But a man who had been spat upon and called nobody had been given a name again worth more than rumor, had been entrusted with power to shape policy, and had, with slow with hands and patient persistence, begun to change the small conditions that allowed dignity to live. If nothing else, the world had learned that being seen matters, that names carry weight, that power must sometimes be used to lift rather than silence, that a child's voice, small and insistent, can keep a father honest.
Bernard and Molly turned back inside, the hallway lights soft against their faces, the door closing like a punctuation mark on a story that had been ugly and finally hopeful. If Bernard's story moved you, like and share to amplify stories of workers who deserve to be seen.